Or the mind behind the weapon, the Webley Mix-6 and the designers who armed an empire's officers. The workshop air tasted of cordite and winter cold. Birmingham, December 1914, and in the half-light filtering through soot-streaked skylights, a man whose name would never appear in dispatches raised his arm toward the testing range backstop. The revolver settled into his palm, 2.5 pounds of blued steel, break-top mechanism, .455 caliber, barrel length precisely 5 inches. Outside, trains carried young officers toward French ports and Flanders mud. Inside this red brick building on Weeman Street, 3 generations of gunsmithing tradition prepared to arm them with something that might bring them home alive. He squeezed the trigger. The recoil was brutal, honest. The sound echoed off brick walls like a judge's gavel. In 14 months, this weapon would become standard issue for every British officer from subaltern to general. But in this moment, it was simply a question waiting for war to answer. Could Birmingham craftsmanship stop a man charging across no man's land before he reached your trench? 300 miles away, in the frozen mud outside Ypres, officers were dying with gentlemen's revolvers jammed in their holsters. The telegrams came daily now, coded reports that spoke of equipment failures and close quarters difficulties. What they meant was simpler. British officers carried weapons designed for sporting purposes, for colonial policing, for an empire that believed wars were won by discipline and artillery. They carried patchwork arsenals, Webley Mach 5 models, various .455 patterns, civilian purchases brought from home. And when battle collapsed into the nightmare intimacy of trench raids, when German stormtroopers appeared 3 feet away in darkness, those weapons failed. The designer set the prototype on the workbench. Beside it lay the morning's telegram from the War Office, another request for standardization, another demand for immediate delivery, another reminder that procurement committees wanted perfection, but production needed pragmatism. His father approached, testing the weapon's weight, working the break-top mechanism with 50 years of experience. The recoil's still hard. It has to be. The .455 round won't forgive light construction. Officers in France need stopping power, not comfort. The War Office will say it's too heavy. The War Office isn't carrying it through Flanders mud. Outside, December rain began to fall, turning Birmingham's industrial landscape into impressionist watercolor. Smoke, brick, steel bleeding together in grey English afternoon. They rejected the first submission. I know. They'll reject this one too. Not refined enough for an officer's sidearm. The designer's jaw tightened. He thought of the telegram, of coded language that meant men dying. He thought of officers he'd never meet who would trust this weapon with their lives. Then I'll redesign it. Again. Until they understand that reliability isn't about polish. It's about mechanisms that forgive mud, cold, fear, and shaking hands. The first twist came that evening. A captain appeared at the workshop door. Muddy boots, 3 days' stubble, eyes that had seen things Birmingham couldn't imagine. He'd come on medical leave, heard rumors about a new revolver, wanted to see it before returning to France. The designer showed him the prototype. The captain held it like soldiers hold weapons, checking balance, testing grip, working the mechanism. Then he did something procurement committees never thought to do. He deliberately dropped it on concrete. The clatter echoed through the workshop. The designer's heart stopped. The captain picked it up, brushed off dust, loaded it, and fired 5 rounds without a single malfunction. "This will work when the others don't," he said quietly. "That's all that matters." He walked out into December rain, leaving the prototype scratched, dented, and suddenly more valuable than any polished display piece. The designer stared at it, at fresh scratches on blued finish, at the mechanism that had absorbed impact and kept working. In that moment, he understood something the War Office couldn't. Elegance was a lie told by people who'd never needed their equipment to save their lives. But understanding wasn't adoption. 3 more rejection letters arrived before Christmas. Too heavy, grip angle awkward, hammer spur catches on equipment. Each objection revealed the chasm between procurement thinking and battlefield reality, between what looked good in committee rooms and what kept men alive in darkness. If stories like this make you question what you do when everyone says you're wrong, but you know you're right, tell us in the comments. And stay with us for the next chapters. January 1915 brought snow to Birmingham and mounting casualties to France. The designer worked through nights now, workshop lamps burning until dawn, while he refined dimensions by fractions, testing each change against one question. Will this work when an officer's hands are shaking, when metal is frozen, when there's mud in every mechanism and seconds to live or die? He'd been 12 when he watched a gentleman's revolver nearly cost his father an eye because someone had prioritized beauty over function. That moment, the misfire, the flash, his father's hand going to his face, had carved itself into his working philosophy deeper than any specification. He'd grown up in these workshops, fourth generation of Webleys, to learn gunsmithing from metal speaking through fingertips. His grandfather had perfected the break-top action. His father had designed the MKV. He'd inherited their understanding of how steel behaved under stress, how mechanisms that worked in London proof houses could seize in November rain. At 32, he carried the weight of knowing his decisions would be carried into combat by men who would never know his name. The second rejection came with detailed notes, too heavy for daily carry. Grip angle unsuitable. Prominent hammer spur presents snagging hazard. Each criticism technically correct, each missing the fundamental point. This wasn't a target pistol. This was a weapon to be grabbed in panic, fired instinctively in darkness, and trusted absolutely when every other tool failed. He redesigned anyway, shortened the barrel from 6 inches to 5, refined the grip angle by degrees, broadened the hammer spur, adding checkering to prevent slippage. The break-top mechanism remained non-negotiable. Push the lever, snap open, extractor lift spent cases, drop in fresh rounds, snap shut, 7 seconds for trained hands, 10 for an officer who'd fired twice before deployment. His grandfather had proven its worth in South Africa. His father refined it through colonial service. He would stake the family's reputation. It would save lives in France. The third rejection cited production concerns. Could Webley meet demand? Could parts be interchanged? Could repairs be made in field conditions? Each question valid, each requiring answers that transformed workshop craft into industrial process. "You're killing yourself over this," his father said one February morning, finding him asleep at the drafting table. "Men are dying with jammed weapons. Every day I delay is another officer who doesn't come home. You can't save them all. I can try." The medium twist came from unexpected advocacy. A colonel from the Small Arms Committee visited in late February, not for formal evaluation but personal initiative. He'd carried a Webley through the veldt, understood the difference between weapons that looked impressive and weapons that worked. After 3 hours in the workshop, he asked the question that mattered. If you were sending your son to France, would you trust him with this weapon? The designer met his eyes directly. "I'd insist on it." The colonel nodded, seeing past polished finish to fundamental reliability, but even his advocacy couldn't overcome procurement momentum. The fourth rejection came in March, citing budget constraints. The Empire needed rifles, machine guns, artillery shells. Officer sidearms ranked lower. What procurement couldn't see was that reliability had mathematics they refused to calculate. A weapon working 95% meant 5 officers per 100 died with useless steel. The Webley MK6 would work 99.5%. That difference, 4.5 percentage points, meant lives measured in sons, brothers, fathers who would come home or wouldn't. In quiet hours, he held the prototype and felt its weight, its balance. This weapon carried 4 generations of accumulated wisdom. Most importantly, it carried a promise. When an officer reached for it in darkness, when seconds separated life from death, the mechanism would move, the striker would fall, and the weapon would speak the only truth that mattered: reliable violence delivered when needed most. His wife found him at the drafting table one evening, surrounded by rejected submissions and casualty analyses. "They're not going to approve it, are they?" she said quietly. "The colonel is trying. But procurement moves like glaciers, and men are dying like flies. You can't carry all of them." He had no answer for that. Nobody did. March 1915, and telegrams from France grew darker. Not just equipment failures, but detailed casualty reports, painting grim pictures of close-quarters combat, where British officers faced German stormtroopers armed with Luger pistols, Mauser C-96-6, weapons less powerful but lighter, faster, and critically more reliable in mud-caked hands. The designer read these reports in the workshop's small office, each one a meditation on failure. Lieutenant X found deceased with service revolver jammed. Captain Y survived, but reports 3 misfires during engagement. Major Z killed in hand-to-hand combat, revolver found loaded but cylinder frozen, suspected moisture penetration. Each report was a man who would never see home. Each was a problem proper engineering could have prevented. His wife found him at the drafting table, surrounded by rejected documents and casualty analyses. She set tea beside him and waited in the way she'd learned over 14 years. "You can't carry all of them," she said quietly. "If I don't, who will?" She had no answer. The small twist came in early April. Officers on leave were actively seeking Webley Mk6 prototypes, not through official channels, but through invisible networks of men who knew Birmingham workshops produced something better. They came in muddy uniforms, offering personal funds, asking to purchase weapons that technically didn't exist for official inventory. The designer had to turn them away. Selling unapproved weapons would doom any chance of formal adoption. But each refusal carved itself into his conscience. Men who wanted to survive, sent away, because procurement committees moved slower than casualty lists grew. Then came the medium twist. A major from the Royal Artillery appeared with authorization for field testing. Not full adoption, just permission to issue 10 prototypes to officers in his battery for 90 days of combat evaluation. The narrowest crack in institutional resistance, but cracks were where light entered. The designer worked 18-hour days preparing those 10 weapons. Each hand-fitted, each mechanism tested 500 cycles, each detail scrutinized. These 10 revolvers would either prove his claims or destroy them. The weapons shipped in late April. Then came the hardest part: waiting. Reports from France took weeks, filtered through bureaucracy and censorship. The designer returned to normal production, but his mind remained fixed on those 10 weapons somewhere in Flanders mud. "You've done everything possible," his father said. "The weapons will work or they won't." "They'll work. I know they'll work." Knowing isn't the same as proving. And proving takes time you can't control. In early May, a letter arrived, personal correspondence from the major conducting trials. The designer opened it with shaking hands. The weapons performed flawlessly in conditions that destroyed 3 standard-issue revolvers. Mk6 fired reliably after submersion in shell-hole water, after 3 days without cleaning, during sustained engagement. Officers in my battery now consider them essential equipment. Strongly recommend immediate adoption. The designer read it 3 times, feeling something loosen in his chest. Not triumph yet. Formal adoption required more than one recommendation, but validation that reliability outweighed refinement, that function surpassed form. But validation brought new pressures. The Major's report triggered renewed War Office interest, which meant formal testing protocols, evaluation boards, bureaucratic machinery that could take months while men died with inadequate weapons. The designer pushed harder, prepared technical documentation, created production schedules, addressed every previous objection with evidence, mathematics, and simple truth that delay measured itself in British officers' lives. His youngest child asked why father was never home. His wife answered with love, shadowed by strain, "He's trying to save people." True, but incomplete. He was trying to save people, yes, but also to prove that 100 years of family craftsmanship had meaning, that workshop wisdom could alter survival mathematics in ways procurement couldn't calculate. Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. Formal testing came in stages, each designed to break the weapon systematically. May 1915, and the designer traveled to Enfield proving grounds with 6 pre-production prototypes, knowing every test would be witnessed, documented, used either to justify adoption or final rejection. The stakes had crystallized: pass completely or fail completely. No middle ground remained. First tests were standard: accuracy at 25 yards, temperature ranges, sustained firing sequences. The Webley Mk6 passed easily. Tests designed for sporting weapons, for controlled conditions, for warfare fantasy existing only in peacetime planning. The evaluating officer was Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, who'd served in South Africa and understood the difference between range performance and battlefield reliability. He watched standard tests with polite attention, then said quietly, "Let's see what it does when we stop being gentlemen." What followed was systematic torture. The prototype fired until barrel glowed red, then immediately submerged in ice water. Thermal shock would crack lesser metallurgy the Webley's steel held. The mechanism was coated in sand, worked repeatedly, fired. The weapon was dropped from shoulder height onto concrete, loaded, fired without cleaning. Then Morrison did something unexpected. He ordered the prototype placed in a barrel of chalky water mixed with cordite residue, shell-hole water composition from Flanders, and left it submerged overnight. The message was clear. This was the real test. The designer spent that night unable to sleep, running calculations about water penetration, moisture affecting powder charges, whether weather seals would hold against prolonged submersion. Every design choice compressed into one night of doubt and cold certainty that reliability was everything. Dawn came grey. Morrison retrieved the weapon from its bath. Water streamed from barrel. Cylinder crusted with chalk residue. Without cleaning, Morrison loaded 6 rounds and handed the weapon to the designer. "Your weapon, you fire it." Cold, wet, dirty weight settled into his palm. This was the moment. Everything, workshop nights, rejected submissions, casualty reports, compressed into the simple act of squeezing a trigger. He raised the revolver and fired. First round fired clean, then second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, not a single malfunction. The mechanism procurement committees called too crude had functioned perfectly under conditions that would render refined designs useless. Morrison examined it closely, then turned to the observation committee. "This will work when the others don't. That's all that matters." The twist came in aftermath. The committee didn't immediately recommend adoption, bureaucracy moved too slowly, but authorized expanded field trials. 50 weapons to 3 battalions, comprehensive reporting, 90-day evaluation. Progress measured in increments, but progress. The crack in institutional resistance had widened. Back in Birmingham, the designer converted the workshop to small batch production. 50 weapons meant 50 individually fitted actions, 50 tested mechanisms, 50 promises each would work when needed. The workshop ran 2 shifts, machinists working through nights. The weapons shipped in late May, then waiting again. Longer because 50 weapons across 3 battalions generated more data but took longer to compile. June brought first informal feedback, letters from officers using trial weapons. Not official reports, but personal correspondence, praise that mattered more because it came from men whose survival depended on the tool working. Fired for first time in anger during trench raid. 3 shots, 3 Germans down, weapon never hesitated. Dropped in shell hole during bombardment. Retrieved 4 hours later covered in mud. Fired immediately without cleaning. Still functions perfectly. Each letter was validation, but also weight. The designer had built a weapon that worked, which meant responsibility for every time it was used, every life it saved or failed to save. The small twist: other manufacturers began protesting. If Webley MK6 was adopted, it would freeze them out of lucrative contracts. They raised questions about production capacity. The resistance shifted from technical concerns to economic competition, which was admission the weapon had proven its worth. In late June, Morrison sent word. The observation committee was preparing final recommendations. Field trials generated data that couldn't be argued. Reliability rates exceeding 99%. Officer satisfaction universal. No mechanical failures, not attributable to improper handling. But recommendation wasn't adoption yet. That required formal procurement approval, contract negotiations, production schedules. The designer could only wait, continue small batch production, and trust evidence would overcome inertia. What would you sacrifice to save lives no one knows you're saving? The telegram arrived Tuesday morning, early July. Webley MK6 approved for immediate adoption as standard officer sidearm. Initial contract 10,000 units. Production to commence immediately. 6 months of rejections, redesigns, institutional resistance compressed into one sentence. The weapon procurement committees, called too crude, would now arm every British officer. Victory felt like responsibility growing heavier. Within 48 hours, Birmingham workshop transformed into war production. The designer's father supervised conversion. Sporting rifle production ceased, civilian contracts suspended, every lathe redirected towards single purpose. New workers hired and trained, quality control procedures established. The workshop that produced hundreds annually now faced demands for thousands. First production run shipped late July, 500 Webley MK6 revolvers in wooden crates bound for France. Each tested through 50 firing cycles, each mechanism checked. The designer watched them load onto railway cars and felt the weight of what he'd created. Tools that would save lives, yes, but also instruments ending them. Feedback from France began arriving in August, letters from officers whose survival depended on the weapon working. Used during trench raid at dawn, fired all 6 rounds in near darkness. Weapon never hesitated despite mud from shell hole. Dropped during hand-to-hand combat, retrieved minutes later, cleared mechanism one-handed while defending myself, fired immediately, saved my life. Each letter validated the fundamental principle: reliability outweighed every other consideration. But each carried weight. The knowledge his creation now participated in warfare's intimate violence. The big twist came from unexpected consequence. Officer survival rates in close combat began improving measurably. Staff officers analyzing casualty data noticed the pattern. Battalions issued Webley MK6 showed lower officer mortality during trench raids. The difference was statistically significant. Approximately 3 additional officers per battalion surviving per quarter. Small numbers in absolute terms, 3 men per battalion, but across the British Expeditionary Force they added up. Hundreds of officers who would have died with jammed weapons instead came home. The designer had changed survival mathematics in ways procurement committees never calculated. But success brought complications. Production demands escalated. 10,000 became 20,000, then 50,000. The workshop expanded, taking over adjacent buildings, hiring more workers, establishing supply chains. What had been family craftsmanship scaled into industrial process. The designer found himself managing production logistics rather than refining designs. His father watched him transform from craftsman to factory manager. This isn't the work you love. No, but it's the work that needs doing. You proved your point. The weapon works. You could step back." The designer shook his head. "Every weapon that leaves this workshop carries my name, even if nobody knows it. I can't step back from that responsibility." The second consequence emerged slowly. Other Commonwealth nations began adopting the Webley Mk6. Canada requested production rights. Australia placed orders. New Zealand, South Africa, India. The Empire's military infrastructure standardized around a weapon designed in Birmingham workshops. By September, the workshop produced nearly 1,000 revolvers weekly. Quality control remained rigorous, but production had become industrial routine. The designer walked through the facility and saw his grandfather's innovations scaled to wartime demands, his father's refinements replicated by workers who'd never held a file before August. His wife found him one night in the workshop, holding a production weapon, testing its weight with unconscious grace. "You did it. You made something that matters. I made something that kills people. You made something that keeps our officers alive long enough to end the war and come home." That's not the same thing. He wanted to believe that, but the weapon in his hands didn't distinguish between defensive use and offensive action. It simply worked, exactly as designed. The final twist came in October. The designer received official recognition from the War Office, a letter thanking him for contribution to war effort. Bureaucratic, formal recognition that looked good in files but meant little. His name wouldn't appear in newspapers. No history books would record his struggles. The weapon would be remembered. The maker would be forgotten. He showed the letter to his father, who smiled sadly. "Welcome to gunsmithing. The tool endures. The maker fades." By year's end, over 30,000 Webley Mk6 revolvers had been produced. The weapon rejected 5 times, now armed British officers across every theatre. Casualty reports confirmed improved survival rates. Reliability had won its argument with elegance. Victory measured not in awards, but in officers who came home. The war ended on grey November morning in 1918, and the designer stood in the workshop, now sprawling production facility, surrounded by machinery that had produced over 300,000 Webley Mk6 revolvers. The silence felt wrong. Machinery idle for the first time since 1915. His father had died in 1917, quietly in his sleep, worn down by 70 years and 4 years of wartime production. The old man's last words had been about tolerances and spring tension, his mind fixed on craft that defined 4 generations. Legacy felt complicated now. The weapon he'd created to save lives had indeed saved them. Casualty analyses after armistice confirmed officer survival rates improved significantly. Approximately 4,000 British officers owed their survival to a weapon that simply worked when everything else failed. That was victory, measurable and real. Yet those same 300,000 revolvers had also ended German lives, Turkish lives, Bulgarian lives. Reliability served survival and violence equally. The designer had created a tool that kept its promises absolutely, and every promise carried moral weight he couldn't quite resolve. The first big twist came in 1919. The military refused to decommission the Webley Mk6. Other weapons were being replaced, updated, modernized. But the revolver procurement committees, once rejected for being too crude, remained standard issue. The weapon had proven itself so thoroughly that institutional memory shifted. What had been controversial became conventional wisdom. The designer found this validating and troubling. He'd been right when everyone said wrong. Yes, but being right didn't feel like victory. It felt like responsibility that never ended. Veterans began appearing at the workshop. Men who'd carried the Webley Mk6 through France, Italy, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia. They came to thank him, to share stories of the weapon saving their lives. Each visit was gratifying and exhausting. One captain who'd survived 4 years in France said something that haunted him afterward. "It wasn't just that it worked. I knew it would work." In the worst moments, I could reach for my Webley and know absolutely it would fire. That certainty saved my life, more than the bullets did. Certainty. The designer had designed for reliability, but what he'd created was certainty, psychological as much as mechanical. Officers trusted his weapon absolutely because it never betrayed that trust. The second big twist spread across years. The Webley Mk6 remained in service through the interwar period, through World War II, through colonial conflicts in the 1950s, even into the 1960s. 50 years of military use for a design finalized under 1914's crisis pressure. The weapon that seemed crude to committees outlasted every refined design proposed to replace it. The designer lived to see his creation become legendary, though not in ways newspapers celebrated. There were no decorations, no public recognition, no history books mentioning his name. The Webley Mk6 was simply there. Standard equipment, reliable tool, anonymous excellence enduring precisely because it was unremarkable. He retired in 1947, leaving the workshop to younger hands. Sometimes veterans would track him down, older men now, grandfathers who'd carried his weapon through 2 world wars. They wanted to shake his hand, to say thank you. He accepted their gratitude with quiet grace, never quite knowing how to explain he'd only tried to build something honest, something that kept its promises, something that worked. He died in 1956, quietly, his name unknown to most who'd carried his creation. The obituary mentioned his role in firearms manufacturing, but focused on family's contribution to local industry. No mention of the struggle against institutional resistance, the sleepless nights, the weight of knowing his decisions measured themselves in human lives. But the weapon endured. The Webley Mk6 became iconic, not through revolutionary innovation, but through fundamental honesty. It promised to work, and kept that promise for 50 years. In museums now, the Webley Mk6 rests behind glass, its break-top action frozen. Curator cards explain specifications, service history, place in British military heritage. What they don't explain is the human cost of its creation, the designer who sacrificed recognition for functional excellence, the institutional resistance valuing tradition over innovation. The quiet certainty that reliability mattered more than any other quality. The designer had wanted to save lives. He succeeded, though at personal cost he couldn't have imagined. His name faded while his creation endured, exactly as his father predicted. The tool remained. The maker was forgotten. The Webley Mk6 proved that changing warfare doesn't require revolutionary innovation. Sometimes it requires only courage to be right when everyone says you're wrong, stubbornness to resist institutional inertia, and craft to build something fundamentally honest that time itself vindicates. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.